My name is Michael Harris. I'm 40 years old. Lately, my wife and I had been living more like roommates than partners. Our children were grown. The house was quiet. And for the first time, divorce didn't feel dramatic. It felt logical. A few months ago, I flew to Chicago for a work seminar. That's where I met a young married couple who said something I didn't believe at first. After 10 years together, they started feeling something they hadn't felt since they were 18. Not excitement and not butterflies. Something quieter and more dangerous. It started with a ritual they added before sleep. They said most couples would refuse to do it. I didn't fully understand what they meant until a few hours later, when I was sitting alone on a plane, flying back to England, realizing I might be bringing something home that could either save my marriage or end it for good. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're with someone or you've ever lost someone, subscribe and leave a comment. Now let me tell you what happened on that flight. The truth is, the distance between my wife and me didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through ordinary days. Mornings where we coordinated schedules instead of touching. Evenings where we sat in the same room but lived in different hours. We still cared. That was the problem. Caring without warmth turns into something heavy. You start keeping score without meaning to. You notice who stops asking questions first, who goes to bed earlier, who no longer waits. When the children were younger, the house never gave us time to examine ourselves. There was always noise, urgency, someone needing something. Now the silence had space to grow teeth. We filled it with routines, with politeness, with the quiet agreement not to ask, "Is this it?" I remember one night standing in the kitchen after dinner, watching my wife rinse a plate that was already clean. She looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I wanted to say something meaningful, something honest. Instead, I asked if she wanted tea. She said no. And that was the end of the evening. Chicago wasn't meant to be important. Just another seminar. Another hotel. Another name badge clipped to a jacket. I didn't even mention the exact dates when I booked the flight. Not because I was hiding anything, because it didn't feel necessary anymore. That realization unsettled me more than any argument we'd had. On the second day of the seminar, during a break that stretched longer than planned, I found myself sitting at a small table near the back of the conference hall. That's where I met them. A young married couple, relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not performative, not loud, just present with each other. They weren't glued together. They weren't showing off. But there was a gravity between them that kept pulling them back into the same orbit. At some point, the conversation drifted away from work. Someone joked about marriage surviving past 10 years. That's when the woman smiled, not proudly, not ironically, and said something that made me pause. She said that after 10 years together, they had started feeling something they hadn't felt since they were 18. Not excitement, not butterflies, something quieter, something that made them uncomfortable at first. I asked what she meant. Her husband looked at her before answering, as if checking whether it was okay to say it out loud. Then he told me it started with a ritual they added before sleep. Something simple. Something most couples would refuse to do once they'd been together long enough. They didn't explain it fully. Not then. They spoke around it, the way people do when they're not trying to convince you, just describing a fact. I nodded politely, assuming it was another version of advice that sounds profound until real life gets in the way. Still, the word refuse stayed with me. People refuse things that threaten the balance they've learned to survive in. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I couldn't stop thinking about my own nights. About how sleep had become an escape instead of a meeting place. About how my wife and I turned off the light facing opposite directions, careful not to disturb the fragile peace of not talking. I didn't yet believe the couple from Chicago, but I realized something uncomfortable. I was listening. And that meant part of me hadn't given up yet. By the time I boarded the plane back to England, the conversation from Chicago had lodged itself somewhere deeper than curiosity. I replayed it not because it sounded hopeful, but because it sounded inconvenient. Most couples would refuse to do it. That phrase kept circling. I thought about how my wife and I avoided inconvenience with professional precision. We avoided late conversations, avoided saying the wrong thing, avoided the kind of honesty that can't be smoothed over by sleep. Our nights were efficient, predictable, empty, and suddenly I realized that whatever ritual that couple had described wasn't adding romance to their marriage. It was removing the shields they'd built to survive it. As the plane leveled out, I opened my notes from the seminar and didn't read a single word. Instead, I found myself listing moments from my own marriage when we'd chosen comfort over connection. The first time we stopped talking before bed. The night we agreed it was better not to start something. The years where we mistook peace for closeness. I remembered how my wife used to wait for me to fall asleep before turning off her lamp, as if even light had become negotiable. Somewhere along the way, bedtime had turned into a ceasefire instead of a meeting point. I tried to imagine introducing anything new into that silence. Anything that required presence instead of avoidance. The idea alone made my chest tighten. That's when I understood why most couples would refuse. Not because it was complicated, because it was intimate in a way that doesn't flatter you. Because it forces you to be seen without the armor you've polished over years of shared disappointments. I stared at the seat in front of me and realized something unsettling. I didn't want to save my marriage by becoming more interesting, more attentive, or more romantic. I wanted to save it by becoming more honest at the one moment we'd both learned to hide. And for the first time in months, the thought of going home didn't feel neutral. It felt dangerous, because if that ritual worked, it would change us. And if it didn't, it would confirm what we'd both been too careful to say out loud. By the time the cabin lights dimmed, I wasn't thinking about whether my wife would agree to try it. I was thinking about whether I was ready to hear what would surface if she did. When I landed back home, nothing looked different. The driveway was in the same place. The front door still stuck slightly when you pulled it too fast. My wife was in the kitchen when I walked in, moving quietly, as if sound itself had become optional between us. She asked about the trip. I answered in the way I'd learned to answer over the years. Short, factual, harmless. We exchanged updates the way colleagues do after time apart. Nothing was wrong. And that was the problem. That first night, I didn't mention the couple from Chicago. I didn't mention the ritual. I watched instead. Watched how we prepared for bed like two people sharing a schedule rather than a life. She brushed her teeth while I checked my phone. I turned off the light after she'd already turned her back. No conflict. No connection. Lying there in the dark, I felt the weight of all the things we had learned not to say. I understood then that our marriage wasn't ending because of fights. It was eroding because of agreement. Quiet, mutual agreement to stop reaching. Over the next few days, the idea followed me everywhere. At work, in the car, standing in the supermarket aisle deciding between things that didn't matter. I kept hearing that young couple's words, something quieter and more dangerous. I realized they weren't talking about passion. They were talking about exposure. About choosing a moment when neither of you can perform or defend yourself. About letting the day end without pretending it was fine. One evening, sitting across from my wife at the dinner table, I noticed how carefully we avoided each other's eyes. Not out of anger. Out of preservation. We were protecting something fragile by never touching it. And suddenly the ritual didn't feel like a solution. It felt like a test. Not of love, but of courage. That night, as we climbed into bed, I felt the familiar urge to stay silent. To postpone. To tell myself tomorrow would be better. But I remembered the way that couple had spoken. Not excited, not hopeful, just certain. And before my courage could thin into hesitation, I said her name. She turned, surprised, as if the sound itself had broken a rule. I didn't explain everything. I didn't sell it as a fix. I told her about Chicago. About a couple who said they had nearly lost each other and found something unexpected by changing how their nights ended. I said it wasn't comfortable, that it scared me, that most couples wouldn't try it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't answer right away. She stared at the ceiling the way she used to when our children were small and sleep came slowly. Finally, she said something I hadn't heard in a long time. What if it makes things worse? I realized then that this was the moment the ritual truly began. Not with words, but with the admission that we were both afraid of the same thing. That night, we didn't try it. We lay there, awake, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that had learned to survive without intimacy. Her breathing eventually slowed. Mine didn't. I stared at the ceiling and understood something uncomfortable. The ritual wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about removing the last place we could hide. And once that place was gone, whatever was left would have to speak for itself. The next day, my mind drifted back to Chicago, to the couple I'd met almost by accident. We hadn't exchanged numbers. We hadn't promised to stay in touch. It was one of those conversations that happens when you don't expect anything from it, and so you tell the truth. They'd been sitting at a small table near the hotel bar, sharing dessert instead of drinks. I remember noticing how quiet they were together. Not bored. Settled. When I asked how long they'd been married, the woman smiled and said, "Long enough to almost lose it." They didn't talk about romance the way people usually do. No grand gestures. No advice. The man said something that stayed with me. Most couples end the day the same way they lived it. Managing, performing, protecting. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "We decided to end it differently." I asked what they meant, expecting something clever or extreme. Instead, they hesitated. The woman looked at him, then back at me, as if checking whether I was ready to hear something I couldn't unhear. "It's not for everyone," she said. "Most people refuse at the moment they understand what it requires." I pressed them. They didn't explain the ritual and steps. They explained the cost. They said it forces you to confront the version of yourself you bring home every night. The one who wants comfort without honesty, peace without vulnerability. They said it made them feel young again, not because it was exciting, but because it was terrifying in a way they'd forgotten. On the flight home, those words replayed themselves over and over. By the time the plane landed, I wasn't thinking about saving my marriage anymore. I was thinking about whether I was willing to risk it. Because that was the real question. The ritual didn't promise closeness. It promised clarity. And clarity can be cruel. Over the next week, I watched my wife more closely. Not critically, tenderly. I noticed the way she paused before speaking, as if measuring whether something was worth the effort. I noticed how often she chose silence, not to punish me, but to preserve herself. I realized that if we were roommates, it was because we had slowly agreed to stop asking anything of each other. One evening, as we cleared the dishes, I told her I wanted to try it. Not as a test, not as a solution, just once. I told her what the couple had told me, that it would be uncomfortable, that it might make things worse, that it would remove the last polite layer between us. I told her I was afraid of what we might find. She didn't say yes right away. She dried her hands, folded the towel carefully, and leaned against the counter. "And if it shows us something we can't fix?" she asked. "Then at least we'll know," I said. And even as I said it, I felt the weight of what knowing might cost. That night, lying beside her, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not dread, responsibility. The ritual wasn't something we would do to each other. It was something we would allow to happen between us. And once it began, there would be no pretending it was just another night. I reached for her hand in the dark. She didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back either. She just let it rest there, warm, familiar, uncertain. In that small, fragile moment, I understood why the couple had called it dangerous. Because whatever survived it would be real, and whatever didn't had probably already been gone. That was when I decided. If we were going to face the truth of us, I wanted to do it deliberately. I wanted to plan it, to write it down, to make sure that whatever I brought into that room was honest enough to matter. And as I turned onto my side, already shaping the words in my head, I had no idea how little time I had left to say them. By morning, the plan had taken shape in my head with a clarity that surprised me. Not the ritual itself. I still hadn't heard it explained in a way that felt safe to repeat, but the intention behind it. I understood what it was meant to replace. All the small evasions, the polite lies, the way we ended days by collapsing into sleep without ever touching what actually hurt. The ritual wasn't an addition to marriage. It was a subtraction. It removed distraction. It removed performance. It removed the comfort of postponing the truth. I wrote the letter over the course of several nights. Not quickly, not dramatically. I wrote it the way you clean out a room you've lived in too long, slowly, picking things up one by one, deciding what was honest enough to keep. I didn't accuse her. I didn't defend myself. I wrote about what I had stopped saying because it felt easier to stay quiet. I wrote about the moments I chose calm over closeness. I wrote about the nights I lay beside her feeling like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. And I wrote about fear, the kind that doesn't shout, but slowly convinces you that asking for more is selfish. The letter wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was a map. A way to say, this is where I am when the lights go out. This is what I carry into bed. This is what I've been protecting you from, and what I've been protecting myself from too. The ritual, as the couple had described it, began here. Not with words spoken aloud, but with the willingness to let the day end without armor. I imagined how I would give it to her. Not immediately, not theatrically. After dinner, after the house had settled into that familiar quiet. I imagined asking her to read it before sleep, and then to sit with me in silence. No fixing, no arguing, just letting whatever surfaced exist between us, uncorrected. The thought terrified me, which is how I knew it mattered. I booked my return with the kind of absent-minded efficiency that comes from finally deciding something. I didn't call her from the airport. I wanted the words on paper to arrive before my voice did. On the plane, I reread the letter once, then folded it and didn't touch it again. I kept thinking of what the man in Chicago had said, how ending the day differently had changed everything. Not because it saved them, but because it stopped lying to them. Somewhere over the channel, I realized something else. Even if the ritual didn't save us, it would change us. It would force a reckoning we had been circling for years. And for the first time in a long while, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like respect. I landed with the strange calm that comes from choosing truth over outcome. I took a taxi instead of driving myself. I wanted to arrive rested, present. I rehearsed nothing. I just held the letter in my coat pocket, feeling its weight like a promise I intended to keep. As the car moved through familiar streets, I noticed details I hadn't in years. The way the evening light hit the windows, the quiet confidence of routine. I thought about the moment I would finally sit beside her and let the day end without escape. We were one turn from home when the truck came through the intersection too fast. I remember the sound first, then the pressure, then nothing that could be arranged into a story. They said it was instant, that there was no pain. I don't know if that's true. What I know is that the letter never left my pocket. And the ritual, the one meant to be done before sleep, was carried into a different kind of night, unfinished, waiting to be read. I wasn't there when she found the letter. I try not to imagine the exact moment, whether it was folded neatly the way I'd left it, or creased from the paramedics' hands, or damp from the rain that had started falling by the time they reached the hospital. I only know that someone gave it to her because it was addressed in my handwriting, because it was the only personal thing I had on me that night. They told her I'd been coming home. They told her it was sudden. They told her there was nothing anyone could have done. She read the letter alone. That much I know, because she told our daughter later that she needed the house to be quiet. No television, no phone calls, just the sound of the clock in the kitchen and the floor settling the way it always did at night. She read it once without stopping, then again more slowly. She said the strangest part wasn't what I wrote, but what I didn't. There was no blame in it, no inventory of mistakes, just an honest description of what it feels like to lie next to someone you love and realize you've been surviving instead of arriving. She said it felt like I was finally sitting beside her the way I used to, years ago, before everything became efficient and careful. The letter ended the way the ritual was meant to begin, not with a solution, but with an invitation, a request to let the day end without pretending, to sit together before sleep and say, quietly, what we were carrying, and then to leave it there, between us, instead of dragging it into the dark. The couple from Chicago never knew what happened. I never wrote to them. I don't think it would have made sense without context, and context was the one thing I could no longer provide. But their words had already done what they needed to do. They had cracked something open in me. They had made it impossible to keep choosing silence out of comfort. Even unfinished, the ritual had reached its destination. The funeral was held a week later, back home. Our children stood together at the front, older than I still thought of them, holding themselves with a composure that felt borrowed from somewhere else. Friends came from work. Family came from places we hadn't visited in years. People spoke about reliability, about dedication, about how calm I always seemed. No one mentioned the letter, because it wasn't theirs to mention. After the service, she stayed behind while the others drifted away. She asked the groundskeeper for a moment alone. When the stone was placed, there was no long quote, no dates carved into sentiment. Just one sentence. The one thing I hadn't had time to say out loud. The rule that had been meant for the end of the day, now marking the end of a life. She said reading it there felt different. Quieter. Final in a way that didn't accuse. Our daughter traced the letters with her fingers and asked what it meant. She told her it meant that love doesn't disappear when you stop talking. It disappears when you stop being honest about what you carry into the night. That was the part one never got to explain. But somehow, it was understood anyway. The stone stayed simple. No poetry. No declarations. Just one sentence carved cleanly into the granite, the way rules are supposed to be. Quiet. Firm. Impossible to misunderstand once you see them. Never take silence to bed. Say what is real. Then let the night hold the rest. People who visited didn't always ask what it meant. Some stood there longer than they planned. Some read it twice. My wife said she noticed that the ones who understood didn't speak right away. They nodded slightly, as if the sentence had named something they had already felt but never articulated. In the weeks after the funeral, the house changed. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone would notice from the outside. But at night, when the lights were off and the world narrowed to the kitchen clock and the sound of breathing, something shifted. My wife began sitting on the edge of the bed before sleep, the way I had once imagined doing. At first, she did it alone. She said the quiet felt different now, not empty, not crowded, just honest. Eventually, our children joined her some evenings. They didn't talk about me much. They talked about their days, about what they were afraid of, about what they didn't know how to carry yet. No one rushed to reassure them. No one tried to fix the feelings before bedtime. They spoke, they listened, and then they slept. Years later, when our daughter told someone about her childhood, she didn't mention the accident first. She mentioned the nights after. The way the house felt safer not because everything was okay, but because nothing had to be hidden before sleep. She said that was when she learned the difference between peace and avoidance. My wife never remarried. Not because she couldn't, but because she no longer believed love needed noise to survive. She carried the rule with her instead. Into friendships, into grief, into the long evenings when memory presses close. She said it didn't make the loss smaller. It made it lighter to hold. Sometimes, she visits the grave alone. She doesn't bring flowers anymore. She sits. She reads the sentence. And then she leaves before it gets dark. She says that's the point, to know when to speak and when to let the night do its work. I didn't get to perform the ritual myself. I didn't get to test whether it would have saved my marriage or ended it. But in a way, that no longer matters. The rule survived me. It reached the people it needed to reach. And that feels like enough. Because love isn't protected by grand gestures or perfect timing. It's protected by the courage to be real before sleep and the wisdom to stop carrying the day into the dark. That was the ritual. And that was the rule I didn't have time to say out loud. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.